The mockery begins. The massive warship Iron Fang floated in the darkness of space, its hull covered in jagged metal plates. It belonged to the Zelfar Dominion, a powerful alien empire that had ruled the stars for centuries. Inside, a meeting was taking place, a meeting that would decide the fate of the human fleet. General Thorak, a towering reptilian warrior, stood at the center of the war room. His golden armor gleamed under the dim red lights, his claws tapping impatiently against the table. Around him, the elite commanders of the Dominion gathered, their sharp teeth bared in cruel amusement. A hologram flickered to life in the middle of the table. It showed a fleet of human warships moving toward the Dominion's territory. They were small compared to the massive alien battleships, their hulls looking fragile and outdated. One of the commanders, a gray-skinned alien with glowing yellow eyes, let out a low growl. "These are the humans," he scoffed. "These rusted machines. They dare challenge us." Laughter filled the room. The commanders of the most feared armada in the galaxy found the idea ridiculous. General Thorak sneered, his forked tongue flicking out. "Pathetic. I expected a true challenge, but instead they send this." He motioned toward the hologram. "These humans must be desperate to face us with such weak ships." A cybernetic officer, his mechanical eye glowing blue, studied the data before speaking. "The human fleet consists of only 100 ships. Their largest warship is barely half the size of our destroyers." He paused, then chuckled. "They must have lost their minds." The room erupted in more laughter. The Dominion had thousands of warships, each equipped with planet-crushing weapons. Humanity, a species that had only recently entered the galactic stage, had no chance. General Thorak leaned forward, his sharp teeth gleaming. "They are walking into their own grave," he said. "We will crush them in a single battle. The humans will beg for mercy." The other commanders nodded in agreement. They had fought against many species before, races far stronger than humanity. Each time, the Dominion had emerged victorious. Thorak turned to his second-in-command, a tall insectoid creature named Commander Foss. "Prepare the fleet," he ordered. "Surround the humans and erase them from existence." Voss bowed his head. "As you command, General." The meeting ended with a final wave of laughter. The commanders were certain that the humans were no threat. The war would be over before it even began. Aboard the human flagship Resolute, Captain Elias Carter stood on the bridge of his warship, watching the enemy fleet from a distance. His face remained calm, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. The Zelfar Dominion had made a mistake, a big mistake. They had underestimated humanity. The enemy thought the human fleet was weak. They thought the ships were outdated. They thought this battle would be easy. They were wrong. Carter turned to his crew, his voice steady. "The enemy thinks we are nothing. They think we will break." The officers around him remained silent, listening. They had heard the enemy's mocking transmissions. They knew the aliens were laughing at them. Carter's lips curled into a smirk. "Let them laugh," he said. "Let them think we are weak." He pointed toward the massive Zelfar fleet ahead of them, thousands of warships glowing with red energy. "They don't know what's coming." The human fleet continued its silent advance, moving through space like ghosts. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. But they were not afraid. They had a plan. And soon, the Zelfar Dominion would learn the truth. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was fire. The trap is set. The Zelfar Dominion fleet moved into position, surrounding the human warships like a pack of predators. Their massive battleships, shaped like jagged blades, formed an unbreakable wall of firepower. Red targeting systems locked onto every human vessel. Inside the enemy flagship Iron Fang, General Thorak grinned as he watched the weak human fleet drift closer. "They are not even trying to retreat," he said, shaking his head. "Foolish." Commander Voss stood beside him, his many eyes scanning the holographic battlefield. "Perhaps they believe they can negotiate," he said, his mandibles clicking. "Or maybe They are simply ready to die. Sorak let out a growl of amusement. Either way, we finish them now. He raised his clawed hand, preparing to give the order to fire every weapon at once. The humans would not even have time to fight back. Aboard the human flagship, Resolute, Captain Elias Carter watched the enemy fleet carefully. His hands were steady. His heartbeat remained slow. This was part of the plan. The Zelfar Dominion believed they had won. They believed humanity had walked into a death trap, but they didn't realize that they were the ones trapped. "Hold steady," Carter ordered, his voice calm. The bridge crew obeyed, their hands hovering over the controls. They could feel the tension in the air. Outside, the enemy fleet loomed over them like a storm about to break. Then, a soft beep echoed through the bridge. The moment had arrived. Carter's eyes flickered to the countdown timer on his screen. 3, 2, 1. He gave the command. Activate the net. The sky ignites. Suddenly, the space around the human fleet came to life. Hidden energy mines, carefully placed in advance, detonated in a synchronized wave. Blinding arcs of blue-white plasma surged outward, forming a crackling barrier that cut the Zelfar fleet in half. Inside Iron Fang, alarm screamed. Sorak's eyes widened as he saw dozens of his warships trapped inside the energy field. Ships that had been preparing to fire now found themselves struggling to move. What is this?" Sorak roared. Commander Voss frantically analyzed the readings. A containment field. They had already prepared the battlefield. It was a trap. The humans had lured them in, allowing themselves to be surrounded. And now, the Zelfar fleet was cut off from retreat. Sorak slammed his fist against the console. Destroy them now. Fire every weapon. But it was too late. The humans had already made their next move. Light them up. On the bridge of the Resolute, Captain Carter leaned forward. His voice was calm, cold, final. Fire. The human fleet unleashed hell. Blinding beams of plasma sliced through the darkness, cutting through enemy warships like paper. Experimental railguns fired rounds at near-light speed, ripping through hulls and detonating reactor cores. Explosions filled the void. Zelfar destroyers twisted and burned, their crews screaming as their ships collapsed under human firepower. Inside Iron Fang, General Sorak watched in horror. The humans, those weak, pathetic creatures, were winning. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear. The trap had been set, and now the stars would burn. The sky ignites. The Zelfar fleet was in chaos. Blinding explosions rippled through the battlefield as human warships unleashed wave after wave of destruction. Plasma beams carved through enemy hulls, leaving burning wreckage in their wake. Railgun rounds shattered shields, punching through metal like it was paper. General Sorak stood frozen on the bridge of the Iron Fang, his slitted eyes wide in disbelief. This was impossible. This was not how the battle was supposed to go. His fleet was stronger. His ships were larger. His weapons were deadlier. And yet, they were losing. "General, our ships are falling apart," Commander Voss shouted, his claws gripping the console as alarms blared across the bridge. "We've already lost a third of our fleet. Their firepower is impossible." Sorak's tail lashed behind him in fury. "It's not impossible. We are the Zelfar Dominion. We have conquered thousands of worlds. These humans are nothing." Another explosion rocked the ship, sending officers crashing to the floor. The Iron Fang shields flickered, struggling to hold against the onslaught. Sorak turned to his weapons officer. "Fire EV or everything." The order was carried out immediately. The Zelfar fleet launched a desperate counterattack. Missiles streaked toward the human warships. Energy beams lit up the darkness. Cannons roared, sending high-impact rounds toward their targets. But the humans were ready. They had seen this move coming. Aboard the Resolute, the counterstrike begins. Captain Elias Carter watched as the Zelfar forces fired back. The void was filled with streaks of energy and missiles heading toward his fleet. His expression didn't change. Defense grid, online, his tactical officer reported. Execute. At once, hidden turrets along the hulls of human warships activated. They fired interceptor rounds and counter missiles, blasting enemy projectiles out of the sky before they could reach their targets. Zelfar beams struck human shields, but the shields held. The aliens had assumed human defenses were weak. They were wrong. "Return fire," Carter ordered, his voice steady. The Resolute's main cannons hummed with power. Then they fired. A massive plasma burst erupted from the human flagship, streaking across space like a star being born. It tore straight through 3 enemy battleships, one after another, before detonating in a massive explosion that engulfed an entire section of the battlefield. Enemy warships cracked apart. Metal melted in the extreme heat. Alien crews screamed before their ships were reduced to drifting wreckage. Carter watched it unfold, his face unreadable. Then he spoke. "Light them up." The entire human fleet responded at once. Ships synchronized their fire, unleashing a perfect storm of destruction. Railguns tore through hulls. Plasma cannons set the stars ablaze. Ion disruptors crippled enemy engines, leaving warships stranded in the burning battlefield. The Zelfar forces, once so sure of their victory, were being slaughtered. The moment of fear. Inside the Iron Fang, General Xorak could only watch in horror. Every screen in front of him showed death. Every second, more of his warships were annihilated. And now, for the first time in his long military career, he understood something terrible. They had underestimated humanity. They had mocked them, laughed at their primitive ships, assumed they were weak. But humanity was not weak. Humanity was fire. And now, the sky itself was burning. "Sir," Commander Voss's voice trembled. "If we stay, we will be wiped out." Sorek's claws tightened into a fist. He refused to accept defeat. But then, another explosion shook the ship. A second later, a holographic alert popped up. Critical damage detected. Shields failing. Weapons offline. The Iron Fang, the greatest warship of the Zelfar Dominion, was falling apart. And General Xorak finally realized the truth. They were not just losing. They had already lost. "The sky ignites," continued. The Iron Fang trembled under the relentless human assault. The once mighty flagship, feared across the galaxy, was now a burning wreck. Its shields flickering, its armor torn apart by railgun rounds and plasma bursts. General Xorak clenched his jaw, his claws digging into the control panel. His pride, his arrogance, all of it had blinded him. He had been so sure of victory, so certain that humanity was no match for the Zelfar Dominion. But now, the truth was impossible to ignore. His fleet, the unstoppable force of the Dominion, was being torn apart like weak prey. The war room was filled with the sounds of screaming officers, blaring alarms, and the deep rumble of distant explosions as more warships were obliterated by human firepower. Xorak turned to Commander Voss, his second in command, his voice filled with rage. "How is this happening? Their ships are smaller. We should have crushed them." Voss's insectoid eyes darted between the battlefield displays. His mandibles twitched with panic. "Their weapons, they are too precise. Their firepower is concentrated in ways we did not expect. Their shields are stronger than our intelligence reported." A fresh explosion rocked the bridge, knocking several officers to the ground. A nearby console burst into flames, and smoke filled the air. Sorek's vision blurred for a second before his focus snapped back. He could not accept this. He would not accept this. Their fleet is still smaller than ours. We outnumber them. We will overwhelm them. He snarled, slamming his fist against the table. Voss hesitated before responding. His voice was low, distant, final. "Sir, we no longer outnumber them." Sorek's eyes widened. He turned toward the holographic display, and what he saw sent a chill down his spine. The Zelfar fleet was collapsing. The once mighty armada, thousands of warships, each capable of reducing planets to rubble, had been cut in half. Hundreds of ships burned in the void, their shattered remains drifting through space. Others, heavily damaged, attempted to flee, only to be picked off by human strike teams. And the worst part, the human fleet was barely scratched. They had taken hits, yes, but they had not broken. They had adapted, countered, outmaneuvered, and now they were winning. Aboard the Resolute, the killing blow. On the bridge of the Resolute, Captain Elias Carter watched the battle unfold, his face calm, his eyes calculating. The enemy was crumbling. The once mighty Zelfar war machine, which had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, was now a graveyard of burning ships. He tapped his fingers on the armrest of his chair before giving the final command. Target the flagship. End this. The Resolute's main weapons locked onto the Iron Fang, feeding real-time targeting data to the rest of the fleet. One by one, human warships shifted their focus, aligning their guns toward the dying beast. Sorek's eyes flickered to his sensors. Hundreds of red markers surrounded the Iron Fang. Weapons were charging. This was the end. The last moments of the Iron Fang. The first shot came from the Resolute. A concentrated plasma lance shot forward, striking the Iron Fang dead center. The ship's failing shields shattered instantly, and the impact sent shockwaves through the entire hull. The second shot followed milliseconds later, a railgun round moving at near light speed. It ripped through the bridge tower, tearing apart entire decks in an instant. Then the barrage began. Hundreds of human warships unleashed their fury upon the once invincible flagship. Railguns, plasma cannons, ion disruptors. The Iron Fang was drowning in fire. Inside, Sorek stumbled, his vision blurred from the relentless shaking of his dying ship. He barely registered the voices of his crew screaming in panic. The warship tilted sharply as its engines failed. Fires spread across the command deck. Explosions burst through the walls, consuming officers in seconds. Sorek gritted his teeth, his claws tightening around the edge of his console. This was not how it was supposed to end. Not to humans, not to them. He tried to give one last order, but no one was listening anymore. His crew was either dead or fleeing. And then, at last, the final blow came. A human missile, launched from the Resolute, pierced the core reactor of the Iron Fang. There was a moment of silence. Then, the Iron Fang detonated in a cataclysmic explosion, a brilliant fireball that lit up the entire battlefield. A shockwave tore through the void, ripping through nearby wreckage, pushing back the surrounding flames. And just like that, the Zelfar Dominion's greatest warship was no more. The fear spreads. Across the battlefield, the remaining Zelfar ships hesitated. They had never seen this before. They had never witnessed the destruction of their greatest flagship. For the first time, fear spread through the ranks of the Zelfar Dominion. They had always believed that they were invincible, that no species could ever challenge them, that no enemy could ever stand against them. But now, they knew the truth. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was fire, and humanity would burn everything in its path. As the last pieces of the Iron Fang drifted into the void, the message became clear. The Zelfar Dominion had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated humanity. And now, the stars were burning. The horror of humanity. The battlefield was a graveyard of shattered warships. Smoke and fire drifted through the wreckage, and the last echoes of explosions faded into silence. The Iron Fang, once the pride of the Zelfar Dominion, was gone, reduced to molten debris. And now, the remaining Zelfar warships faced a terrible reality. They were alone. They had expected an easy victory. Instead, they were staring at annihilation. Aboard the Zelfar warship, Bloodfang, Commander Voss gripped the control panel, his claws trembling. His warship had barely survived the initial attack, but the human fleet was still advancing. His crew, hardened warriors who had conquered entire civilizations, looked terrified. It was unnatural to see Zelfar soldiers in fear. But after what had just happened, how could they not be afraid? They had watched the Iron Fang burn. They had seen thousands of their warships ripped apart like paper. And worst of all, they had seen how coldly, how ruthlessly, how efficiently the humans fought. This was not just war. This was extermination. "Sir," one of his officers whispered, "what do we do?" Voss stared at the battlefield. His instincts screamed to run, to escape. But he knew the truth. There was nowhere to run. The humans had planned this. The humans had predicted their every move. The humans had outplayed them at every turn. Aboard the human flagship Resolute, Captain Elias Carter stood on the bridge, watching the burning remains of the enemy fleet. His face was calm, his hands steady. The battle was almost over. And now, the real lesson would begin. "Tactical report," he said. An officer spoke. "Zelfar forces down to 400 ships, many heavily damaged. Their formation is breaking." Carter nodded. "And our fleet? Minimal losses, shields holding at 70%. No significant damage." Carter exhaled slowly. It was almost disappointing. The Zelfar Dominion had been one of the most feared empires in the galaxy, yet they had folded like amateurs. "They thought we were weak," he murmured. "They thought they could just walk over us." He turned to his communications officer. "Patch me through to the enemy fleet." The officer hesitated. "Sir, they're barely holding formation. Do you think they'll still?" "Patch me through." A moment later, a transmission echoed across the battlefield. Humanity spoke. A message to the enemy. "This is Captain Elias Carter of the United Earth Fleet." His voice rang out. It was calm, but there was no mercy in it. "To the remaining Zelfar commanders, you have two choices. Silence." Then Carter continued, his tone turning cold. "Option 1. You surrender. You drop your weapons. You turn your ships around, and you never, ever come near human space again." A long pause. "Or option 2. We finish what we started." The human fleet shifted, weapons locking onto the remaining enemy ships. "If you think we're bluffing," Carter said, "then stay where you are." His voice turned to steel. "Stay, and watch your last warships burn like the rest." Aboard the Bloodfang, the breaking point, Commander Voss felt his throat tighten. He had never heard a human's voice before, and now that he had, he wished he never had. The voice coming from the human ship was not arrogant, not boastful. It was pure calculation, pure confidence, cold, deadly, unstoppable. The humans knew they had won. They weren't celebrating. They weren't gloating. They were just waiting. Waiting for the Zelfar commanders to decide how they wanted to die. Voss's claws trembled over his control panel. He knew what Torak would have done. The general would have fought to the last ship. But Torak was dead, and Voss didn't want to join him. His next words sealed the fate of the battle. "Transmit a surrender signal." Gasps echoed through the bridge. "Commander," one officer choked, "you can't." "I can, and I will." Voss's mandibles clicked in frustration. "You saw what they did. Do you really want to know what happens if we refuse?" No one answered, because they all knew the humans had held back. They had let some of the Dominion's warships live. If they really wanted to, they could erase every single one. The officer swallowed hard. "Transmitting." Now, a blinking red icon flashed on the console. The Zelfar Dominion had surrendered. The aftermath. Back on the Resolute, Carter watched as enemy ships powered down their weapons. One by one, they turned away from the battlefield, signaling their surrender. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Cease fire." The human fleet stood down, their weapons lowering. The battle was over. Carter turned to his officers. "Send word to Earth. The war is over." A cheer erupted across the bridge, but Carter did not celebrate, because he knew this was not the end. This was just the beginning. The galaxy had seen what humanity could do, and now they would never forget. The final stand. The battle was over. The Zelfar Dominion's warships had powered down, their weapons silenced. Their once mighty fleet, thousands of warships strong, had been reduced to smoldering wreckage. The survivors drifted in the aftermath of humanity's firestorm, their ships damaged, powerless, and humiliated. But deep in the remains of the Dominion fleet, a single warship had not surrendered. It was the Doomfang, an elite dreadnought, one of the last fully operational warships in the enemy fleet. And aboard it, the true horror of the Dominion was unfolding. Aboard the Doomfang, the last act of defiance, High Warlord Zakar, one of the highest-ranking leaders of the Zelfar Dominion, sat in his command chair, watching the destruction of his people. His claws dug into the metal armrests, his tail coiled in rage. "Surrender." His voice was a whisper of disgust. "We are the Zelfar. We do not surrender." His officers shifted nervously, watching their leader with uncertainty. "But, Warlord," one of them hesitated, "the fleet is gone. The battle is lost. If we stay, we will be." Silence. Zakar's eyes burned with hatred as he looked at the human fleet, still waiting in the distance, watching them. The humans had given them a choice: live in defeat or die fighting. Zakar had already made his choice. "We will not crawl before these creatures," he growled. "We will show them the true power of the Dominion." He turned to his weapons officer. "Activate the last sun." Gasps echoed through the bridge. "Sir," the officer's voice shook, "that weapon, it will destroy everything. Our own ships, our own people." Zakar slammed his fist onto the console. "Do it." The crew hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, the officer activated the sequence. A deep hum reverberated through the ship, and a warning flashed across every console. "Last Sunan protocol activated. System overload imminente." The Doomfang had become a bomb. A massive energy overload, powerful enough to rip a hole in space itself, began charging in the ship's reactor. Zakar's lips curled into a smile. "If we die," he whispered, "we take them with us." Aboard the Resolute, the deadliest threat, Captain Elias Carter frowned as a new energy spike appeared on his display. The Doomfang was not powering down, it was charging up. Something was wrong. "Tactical, report," he snapped. An officer's voice came out panicked. "Sir, they're overloading their core. If they didn't, give me the damage estimate." A long pause. Then, in a hushed voice, the officer said, "The explosion will wipe out everything within 50,000 kilometers." Carter's blood ran cold. That was the entire battlefield. Humanity's victorious fleet, the remaining Zelfar warships, even the wreckage of the fallen. Everything would be erased in an instant. It was a suicide strike, a desperate last act of vengeance, and it was already counting down. 4 minutes until detonation. Carter did not hesitate. "All ships, prepare for emergency retreat," he ordered. "Fall back now." His officers scrambled to execute the order, but another warning flashed across the screen. "Danger, energy field DETCTED. FTL engines below CKT." Carter's hands tightened into fists. The Zelfar had activated an anti-FTL field. They had trapped everyone. The impossible decision. On the Doomfang, Warlord Zakar watched with cruel satisfaction as the human fleet struggled to escape. "They will run," he hissed, "but there is nowhere to go. In 3 minutes, they would all be dust." But on the Resolute, Carter wasn't thinking about running. He was thinking about stopping the explosion. He turned to his officers. "What's the reactor core's weakest point?" The chief engineer scanned the readings. "Sir, If we hit the primary containment grid, it might trigger a controlled overload. It won't stop the detonation, but it could redirect the blast outward, away from the fleet. Carter's mind raced. There was a chance, a very slim chance, but someone would have to get close enough to fire the shot. And that was a death sentence. Silence filled the bridge. No one spoke. Then Carter sighed. His decision was made. He stood up and turned to his flight commander. "Ready, my fighter." His crew froze. "Sir," his first officer choked. "You can't mean." "I do." Carter locked eyes with his officers. They all knew what this meant. "This is our only chance," he said. "If we don't do this, everyone dies." A heavy silence. Then, one by one, his officers saluted. The final flight. Minutes later, a single fighter launched from the Resolute, heading straight for the Doomfang. Inside, Carter gripped the controls, his eyes locked on his target. The reactor core was deep inside the ship. He would have to fly through enemy fire, dodge defense turrets, and place a perfect shot, all in under 2 minutes. No room for mistakes. He pushed the thrusters to full power. The enemy opened fire. Lasers streaked past. Missile locks blared. But Carter was faster. He twisted through the wreckage, dodging enemy fire with precision only a human pilot could achieve. 1 minute left. The reactor core came into view. Carter locked on. 30 seconds. His finger hovered over the trigger. 20 seconds. He aimed for the containment grid. 10 seconds. He whispered under his breath, "Burn in hell." He fired. The plasma round hit dead center. A chain reaction erupted inside the Doomfang. Energy surged wildly, uncontrollable. At the last second, Carter pulled up, hitting full thrusters. The Doomfang detonated. The explosion was unimaginable, a blinding flash that tore through the battlefield. But instead of a massive shockwave, the blast was redirected. Outward, away from the fleet. The Zelfar's final weapon had failed. And Carter had survived. The fall of an empire. The shockwave from the Doomfang's explosion rippled across space, scattering debris and sending a wave of energy outward. But instead of erasing everything, the redirected blast shot past the battlefield, leaving the human fleet untouched. Captain Elias Carter had done the impossible. He had stopped the enemy's last desperate attempt to wipe them all out. And now, the Zelfar Dominion had nothing left. Aboard the human flagship Resolute, the bridge crew watched in stunned silence as the remnants of the Zelfar fleet floated lifelessly in the aftermath. It was over. After years of war, after centuries of Zelfar dominance, their empire's greatest fleet was gone. Captain Carter sat in the pilot's seat of his fighter, breathing heavily. His hands ached from gripping the controls too hard. He had barely made it out of the blast. His fighter's systems flickered as he maneuvered back toward the fleet. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Captain Carter, you're alive." It was his first officer, Lieutenant Hale. Carter let out a slow breath. "Damn right I am." A pause. Then, cheers erupted across the fleet. Human officers, soldiers, pilots, everyone who had fought and survived, celebrated the impossible victory. But Carter's expression remained hard, because he knew what came next. He opened a channel to the remaining Zelfar warships, his voice steady. "This is Captain Elias Carter," he said. "Your last hope for victory is gone. Your empire's greatest fleet is destroyed. Your weapons are useless." The silence from the enemy ships was deafening. Carter continued, his tone turning cold. "You can surrender now, or you can try to fight and die like the rest." A long pause. Then, one by one, the remaining Zelfar warships powered down. Their weapons deactivated. Their engines stalled. The once mighty Zelfar Dominion had fallen. The message sent across the galaxy. Word of the Zelfar defeat spread like wildfire. On hundreds of worlds, species that had once lived in fear of the Dominion looked to the stars in disbelief. The unstoppable empire, the conquerors of worlds, had been broken by humanity. And the message was clear. Humanity was no longer a species to ignore. Humanity was no longer prey. Humanity had become the new power among the stars. In the highest chambers of the surviving Zelfar government, chaos erupted. Political leaders screamed at one another. Generals tried to plan retaliation. But there was nothing left. The fleet was gone. The Empire's military might have been shattered. And now, humanity had proven that they were not just another race to be conquered. They were fire. And fire cannot be tamed. Aboard the Resolute, the aftermath, Carter stood on the bridge, staring at the endless field of wreckage beyond the viewport. The battle was over. But war never truly ends. His first officer, Lieutenant Hale, stepped beside him. "Sir, what happens now?" Carter exhaled. "Now." He shook his head. "Now the galaxy learns a lesson." He turned toward his crew. "Prepare a message," he ordered, "to every species in the galaxy, to every government, every leader." His eyes darkened. "Let them all know what happened here today." Hale nodded and began the transmission. As Carter watched the stars, he knew one thing for certain. The Zelfar Dominion was finished. But this war was only the beginning. A warning to the galaxy. The battle was over. The Zelfar Dominion was in ruins. Their once mighty fleet had been reduced to scrap, their warlords dead, and their remaining commanders broken and humiliated. But the real battle, the battle for control of the galaxy, was just beginning. And now, humanity had the floor. Aboard the human flagship Resolute, the broadcast begins. Captain Elias Carter stood at the center of the command deck, his hands resting on the console as his officers prepared the transmission. The message would be sent everywhere, to every species, every government, every empire, republic, and warlord across the stars. Every single one of them would hear humanity's voice. Lieutenant Hale turned from the comm station. "Sir, the transmission is ready." Carter nodded. His face was calm, but there was an edge to his voice as he spoke. "This is Captain Elias Carter of the United Earth Fleet." His words echoed across thousands of planets, space stations, and outposts across the galaxy. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was a warning. Today, the Zelfar Dominion fell. There was silence across the galactic network. The great monsters of the void, the feared Zelfar warriors, had been defeated. By humans. By the very species they had mocked and underestimated. Carter's voice remained steady, but his words were razor-sharp. For centuries, the Zelfar ruled through terror and bloodshed. They enslaved entire worlds, burned civilizations to the ground, and believed no one could stop them. A pause. They were wrong. The silence across the galaxy was deafening. Carter's next words would shape history. "Humanity does not seek war. We do not seek conquest. But let this battle serve as a message, a lesson to all who think we are weak." His voice dropped lower, his words filled with cold certainty. "If you threaten us, we will fight. If you attack us, we will burn your fleets. And if you try to wipe us out, we will turn your empires to ash." He let those words linger, their weight sinking into the hearts of every ruler, every fleet admiral, every warlord who had once thought of humanity as prey. Then he delivered the final warning. "The stars are vast, and we have no desire to rule them. But do not mistake our patience for weakness." His eyes darkened. "Come for us again, and we will not just defeat you. We will end you." The transmission cut off, and across the galaxy, everyone listened. The galaxy reacts. The broadcast shook every corner of known space. On war-torn planets, species that had once suffered under Zelfar rule cheered. They had seen the Empire fall. They had seen humanity's fire, and they rejoiced. But in the halls of power, on the homeworlds of other great empires, the reaction was different. The Vorgoth Imperium, a warlike empire of biomechanical warriors, watched the message in silent calculation. The Karnak's hegemony, A trade empire built on deception and diplomacy whispered cautious warnings. The elder races, the oldest and most advanced civilizations, regarded humanity with newfound respect and fear, because now the galaxy knew. Humanity was not just another species. They were survivors. They were warriors. And they would never, ever bow. Aboard the Resolute, the future of humanity, Captain Carter stood on the observation deck, staring into the endless void. Behind him, the crew celebrated. They had won. They had survived. But Carter knew this was only the beginning. Lieutenant Hale stepped beside him. "Sir, do you think they'll listen?" Carter exhaled slowly. For now. He turned to his officer, his expression unreadable. "But one day, someone else will come." Hale frowned. "Another war." Carter's lips curled slightly. Not a smile. Something harder. Not just a war. He turned back to the stars. A reckoning.